need to integrate Descope authentication into your FastMCP server with just 2 configuration values. We'll use Descope's OpenID Connect discovery to automatically configure JWT validation by pointing to your well-known endpoint. You'll see how to set up the provider with just your Descope configuration URL and server base URL, letting FastMCP handle all OAuth integration automatically through standard OpenID Connect discovery. From FastMCP, import FastMCP. From FastMCP, server, auth, providers, Descope import DescopeProvider. Hash the DescopeProvider automatically discovers Descope endpoints. Hash and configures JWT token validation. Auth provider equals DescopeProvider. Config URL equals https://well-known/OpenID configuration. Hash your MCP server well-known URL. Base URL equals server URL. Hash your server's public URL. Hash create FastMCP server with auth. MCP equals FastMCP. Name equals my Descope protected server. Auth equals auth provider. This demonstrates OpenID Connect discovery with automatic JWT validation, where the DescopeProvider configures authentication by consuming a standard, well-known endpoint. The pattern uses a single discovery URL to fetch all necessary OAuth endpoints, public keys, and token validation rules, eliminating manual configuration of individual parameters. What makes this distinctive is its reliance on OpenID Connect's standardized discovery mechanism rather than hard-coded provider-specific settings. The integration works through declarative provider initialization that triggers automatic endpoint discovery. Your FastMCP server provides only the OpenID configuration URL and your server's base URL for callback handling, while the provider fetches and caches all required OAuth metadata, including JWT signing keys, from Descope's discovery endpoint. This approach maintains separation of concerns. FastMCP handles root protection and token validation, while Descope manages the authentication flow and cryptographic operations. The provider automatically wires up token validation middleware using the discovered configuration. This approach solves the complexity of manual OAuth implementation by leveraging OpenID Connect's standardized discovery protocol. The key benefit is reduced configuration overhead. You only need the discovery URL rather than individual endpoint URLs or public keys. The trade-off is dependency on Descope's OpenID implementation, but this is justified by automatic key rotation and validation rule updates. The pattern is ideal when you need production-grade authentication with minimal setup, though it requires your Descope project to expose a valid OpenID configuration endpoint. Let's break it down line by line. From FastMCP, import FastMCP. This imports DescopeProvider for OAuth 2 OIDC authentication using Descope's OpenID Connect discovery. The provider automatically fetches endpoints and JWT validation keys from Descope's well-known /OpenID configuration URL, eliminating manual endpoint configuration while enforcing secure token validation. The config URL parameter points to Descope's OIDC discovery document, while base URL defines your server's public callback endpoint. For production, use environment variables DESCOPECONFIG URL and server URL instead of hard-coded values. From FastMCP, server, auth, providers, Descope import DescopeProvider. This imports DescopeProvider, FastMCP's authentication handler that automatically discovers Descope's OpenID Connect endpoints. It uses the well-known /OpenID configuration URL to fetch all required OAuth endpoints and JWT validation keys, eliminating manual endpoint configuration. The config URL parameter points to Descope's OpenID discovery document, while base URL defines your server's public callback endpoint. This pattern ensures secure JWT validation while maintaining clean separation between authentication, provider configuration, and your application's public URL.
The DescopeProvider automatically discovers Descope endpoints. And configures JWT token validation. Auth provider equals DescopeProvider.
This initializes the DescopeProvider using OpenID Connect discovery. The config URL points to Descope's well-known /OpenID configuration endpoint, which automatically retrieves all necessary OAuth endpoints and JWT validation parameters. The base URL defines your server's public callback address for handling authentication responses. This approach eliminates manual endpoint configuration by dynamically discovering Descope's OAuth services while automatically setting up JWT validation using the provider's public keys.
Config URL equals https / well-known /OpenID configuration your MCP server well-known URL.
This config URL points to Descope's OpenID Connect discovery endpoint, enabling automatic configuration of authentication parameters. The provider fetches public keys, supported scopes, and token endpoints from this URL, eliminating manual JWT validation setup. The base URL parameter defines your server's public callback address for OAuth flows, while the provider handles all token validation using keys from the discovered OpenID configuration. For production, use DescopeOAuth URL and server URL environment variables to override these settings.
Base URL equals server URL. Your server's public URL.
The base URL parameter defines your server's public URL for handling OAuth callbacks and JWT validation. DescopeProvider uses this alongside the OpenID discovery endpoint, config URL, to automatically configure authentication, eliminating manual OAuth setup. This enables proper JWT validation by fetching cryptographic keys from Descope's OpenID configuration, while ensuring callback URLs match your server's public address. The provider handles all OAuth flows using standard OpenID Connect discovery. This closing parenthesis finalizes the DescopeProvider initialization using OpenID Connect discovery. The provider automatically fetches all required OAuth endpoints, authorization, token, JWKS from Descope's well-known /OpenID configuration URL, eliminating manual endpoint configuration. The base URL parameter defines your MCP server's public callback endpoint for handling authentication responses, while the discovered configuration from Descope's OpenID endpoint handles JWT validation automatically. For production, configure these via DescopeOAuth URL and server URL environment variables.
Create FastMCP server with auth. MCP equals FastMCP. Name equals my Descope protected server. Auth equals auth provider.
This initializes the FastMCP server with Descope authentication using OpenID Connect discovery. The config URL points to Descope's well-known /OpenID configuration endpoint, enabling automatic discovery of all OAuth endpoints and JWT validation parameters, while base URL defines your server's public address for callback handling. The provider automatically configures JWT validation using keys from the discovered OpenID configuration, eliminating manual OAuth implementation while maintaining zero-trust security with short-lived tokens. Dynamic client registration remains available, but isn't shown in this basic setup. Descope OpenID integration. The DescopeProvider leverages OpenID Connect discovery through a well-known configuration URL, automatically handling JWT validation without manual endpoint configuration. The config URL must point to Descope's OpenID configuration endpoint, while base URL defines your server's public callback address for token validation. This pattern replaces explicit client registration with automatic discovery, but still requires DCR enabled in Descope's console for full functionality.
The authentication system that knows every endpoint begins by knowing none.